What is the difference between sin and iniquity? Let's first talk about what sin actually is. The most common word that we translate as sin in the Old Testament is kata, and it shows up about 600 times. It literally means to miss the mark or to fail. If broadly speaking, sin means to miss the mark, then we have to ask this question: what mark are they missing? God made us in His image. This is a unique gift that He did not impart to the rest of creation. Only mankind, men and women, were to be made in the image of God. God's design was for His image bearers to reflect His nature. But we missed the mark by trusting in ourselves instead of trusting Him, which resulted in our rebellion against Him. Later on, God gave Moses the law. And what the law was supposed to do is it was supposed to give the standard for what God was declaring to be good. It was going to be the straight line that we should follow. It was the target for us to aim for. See, we know it mainly by the 10 Commandments, but in reality there were about 613 things for us to follow. Later on in the days of Jesus, someone asked him, he's like, hey, what is the most important law? And Jesus replied, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the great and first commandment. And a second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So one way to look at hitting the mark, to avoid missing the mark, is to love God with all that we are and to love other people as much as we love ourselves. But we miss this mark. We all do. Sometimes we miss because we have the good intentions of hitting it but fail to do so. And other times we miss because we are aiming at a different target altogether. But no matter the cause of missing the mark, Romans 6:23 is very clear, and that says that every sin, whether you're intentionally aiming in the right direction or not, every sin deserves death. However, not all sin is identical. That's why the Bible uses a lot of different words to communicate sin. Depending on what translation you use, you may come across a whole bunch of different words like guilt or iniquity or transgression or rebellion or wickedness or lawlessness or unrighteousness or so many others. All of those words fall under an umbrella of missing the mark, of missing God's design. They fall under the umbrella of sin. While these words can and do overlap, the biblical authors are using different language, different words, to help us have insight into what is really going on. Our question for today is, what is the difference between sin and iniquity? So we will turn our attention to the specific word of iniquity. There are a few words that end up getting translated as iniquity, but the most common one is avon. And at its root is a word avah, which literally means to be crooked or bent or warped out of shape. Iniquities are actions or attitudes that distort, that warp God's design, that takes the good that God has designed and changes it willfully into something that is corrupt. Like, think of David. See, we know David as the guy that was after God's own heart. He knew God, he loved God, and more often than not, he did what was good. But we see this episode in 2 Samuel 11 where David sins. And his sin is not just a slip-up, if you will. It is a willful move from good to corrupt. You see, step one, he sees Bathsheba and he lusts after her. But he doesn't stop and repent. No, he then asks about her, he investigates who she is, and he finds out that she's married to someone named Uriah. It would be a great point for him to stop and repent, but instead what he does is he sins for her and they commit adultery. Still, he does not repent. So instead of repenting, what he does is he conspires to cover up his sin. And when that fails, when that doesn't work, he conspires to have her husband Uriah killed. So it starts with one sin that he did not repent from, and it moves to another and another. See, in David's episode here, it was a series of chosen sins. He was willfully moving from the good of God's design to the corruption that sin leads us to. So iniquity is a sin. but the authors use it to help us understand a willful move towards corruption, a willful move towards distorting or bending or warping the design that God has for us. In closing, I want to give you one more thing about the word avon that I think is really amazing. You see, in Hebrew, which is what the Old Testament was written in, it uses a lot more imagery in its language than the English language does. In the Old Testament, one of the most common ways of communicating God's forgiveness is to use the imagery, "He carried my iniquity," avon. It is usually translated to forgive or forgave, but the imagery of the word is to carry. So our iniquity doesn't just vanish, but what happens is instead of us carrying our iniquity, when God forgives us, He carries it upon Himself. He accepts the punishment of our iniquity when He forgives us. I think this brings up beautiful imagery when we fast forward to Isaiah 53 and we see the suffering servant. And Isaiah says, He will be crushed for our iniquities. Crushed. He who is carrying our iniquities, who forgives us of our iniquities, will be crushed for them. So he who carries our iniquities dies for our iniquities. Like, think about how this points to the cross. Think about how the gospel is evident in such a simple word. For our sake, He made Him who knew no sin become sin, so that in Him we might become the righteousness of God.